everybody. This is Pastor Brady Henderson. I'm the senior pastor of the First Baptist Church in Gaston, South Carolina, and you are listening to the Menorah Podcast. The Menorah Podcast is a weekly podcast ministry of the First Baptist Church of Gaston. The purpose of this podcast is to share the light, speak the light, and send the light of Jesus Christ all across the airwaves of the internet. And this is episode 47. Today is Thursday, January the 16th. This is our second episode, Alan, in 2025, and already halfway through January.
Yep.
So, hard to believe that. If you didn't catch last week's podcast, we would love for you to go back in the archives on YouTube, Buzzsprout, wherever you get your podcast, and listen to that one. We talked about the legacy of a peanut farmer, obviously Jimmy Carter. Alan, I don't know if you had the opportunity to watch any of the funerals and different things. Some very nice things were said, very touching things.
I did not watch a lot of it, but I did see a few clips and things of that nature.
Well, I want to talk to you today about a very interesting subject, one we haven't really discussed before. But I want to talk to you about the dangers of division. When it comes to that, obviously, if you're looking at this podcast on YouTube, you see the long division sign or the division sign on your screen. We're not talking about math, so you can continue to listen to the podcast. We're not going to make you do any math problems. But I do want to talk to you. That's one thing in church life. I've seen it my whole life. I know you have too. One seed of division can grow. And I have seen that so many times, not just church, like anything that you do, your life. And I have this book in front of me that my grandfather wrote. Now, this was Robert Howard Henderson. This was my dad's dad. Obviously, for those of you that know my government name, I was named after him. Anyway, he wrote this book. He spent 40 years studying the genealogy of our entire family. And in 1991, after 40 years of research, he published his book that I have in front of me. But I've mentioned several times about different stories that I've pulled from the book. My dad is number 26. I'm number 27 of ministers in our family. And so, all kind of different stories about that. But in this book, it is so interesting. My grandfather, and by the way, for those that don't know, he passed away in 2001 and was killed in a drunk driving accident. He and his wife were both killed at the same time. Her name was Frances, and so for those of you that know my sister, we were named after Bob and Frances. So my sister's name is Fran. So really thought it'd be cool to kind of bring out, and I read this book once a year, really more than that. I always read it, start it in January, and I usually finish it the first week in January. It's just really cool to hear the stories, and my grandfather paid special attention to the church life. Now, I want you to think about this. So in 1991, there was no internet the way we think of it. There was no Ancestry.com. There wasn't even FindAGrave.com or any kind of thing to help you track who's related to who. It took him 40 years to write the book because that's how long the research took. So, and he had a good job. He was a hard worker. Also, he was a professor at Limestone. A lot of people don't know that. He was a business professor, and then also, in addition to that, he actually went over when the Soviet Union broke apart. He actually went over there and taught them how to start their own businesses. And I can't remember the country. It's a word I can't pronounce, but, one of those over there. And he did that, and then every Sunday, he would teach Sunday school at the funeral home in Greer. It's kind of interesting. For some reason, there were people that would attend Sunday school at the funeral home that would never darken the doors of a church. So he left the comfort of his own Sunday school class and in the church and did that in the funeral home. And he did that for many years. And so, great legacy. I didn't get to know him. Obviously, I was 2 when he passed away, so I didn't get to know him. But there are those in our family that say the history bug jumped down to me. My dad's not into it as much, and so I guess it did. I don't know, but in my free time, that's all I do too. is try to learn something history wise and talk about it. So, but what's interesting is that he mentioned he goes all the way back to where we came from, across the ocean. But when he gets into America, obviously Thomas Henderson was the first one here. But from Thomas all the way down, he brings it all the way to himself. He actually talks about the church membership of each person in the family. And obviously, he had to physically go to these churches and get their minutes, which is really hard, considering how many different churches we're a part of. have a ton of people in our family that were church planners, and I kind of use that term a little loosely because I didn't always plan them for the right reasons. Some of them did, some of them did not.
I think once again, that's God's way of using the mess man makes of life often for his benefit and for the furtherance of his kingdom. A lot of our local churches are splits.
Yeah,
They argued over things that really doesn't matter
yeah,
in the long run, but ultimately what God gains from that division is more churches.
yep. So, as I've read this book, I have found so many different little stories about division in churches. And so I just want to share a few of those, kind of break those down and talk about, and I love our church and I think we're at a great spot in our church. I mean, this past Sunday, almost 300 in worship, almost 200 in Sundays. I mean, it's great, but all that can go away with one loose word or one rumor or one lie. And I just want that to always be on the front of our minds that, hey, as far as God has brought us, if we let division creep in, we're going to be in trouble. And so I want to share a few of those stories. One of my relatives, this is actually, I think, second or third, I can't remember exactly, great-grandfather. His name was Canada Henderson. I call him Kennedy, not Canada. So not Kennedy, not Canada, but Kennedy. And I've actually been to his place where he was buried on Fishhawk Mountain in North Carolina. It's a very remote area over in western North Carolina. I really need to go see if it's still there because of everything that happened with the hurricane and everything that hit that area. But anyway, Kennedy was married to Polly Tillery. And so Polly Tillery was a preacher's daughter. Obviously, that would be one of my other great-great-great-grandfathers on the Tillery side. At this time, Kennedy, was 29 years old. And he was known in the region, in the mountains, as the most eligible bachelor because most of the time in the 1800s, and by the way, he was born in 1799. Okay, so when he was 29, it would have been 1828, right there in John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson's presidency, all that stuff. And so not far, and by the way, most guys did not get married at 29. They usually got married at like 15, 16, 17, 18, really early. And I will add a history nugget there. There has been a recent uprising in the news and media about discrediting or shaming people who lived hundreds of years ago that would marry, an 18-year-old would marry a 13-year-old and all this kind of stuff. Look, I just want to clarify this. I'm not saying it's necessarily right that happened, but you also have to understand the culture and that most people had a lot of children, and the sooner you could get a children off the table, literally, that's one less mouth you have to feed, which means that's less work that you have to do. I just kind of want to add that in there. I've seen a lot of people go on YouTube and call, certain people rapists and things like that. I just don't think you can look. I just think you have to think about the context, and I don't want people to chase me with fire, but torches.
Well, we as human beings are horrible with unconcrete concepts. If we're not familiar with it or if we're not part of it, we don't understand it, and we don't take the time to understand it.
Yep.
We'd rather just haystack on an issue and instead of saying, hey, this things were a little different then, and there were reasons for these things.
Yes.
Again, whether they're good or bad, it was just a different time.
And that's not for us to judge.
Correct.
I don't like it when people make blanket statements like that on history. But anyway, Kennedy, like I said, he was 29, and he was what is presently day known as Hot Springs, North Carolina. Back then it was Warm Springs. But anyway, there was the Tillery family lived right down the way, and that's usually what happened is you married the closest family. I mean, there weren't gobs of people, especially in the mountains of North Carolina.
And proximity. I mean, that's who you knew.
Yeah, exactly. Family tradition, actually on page 91 of this book, is actually tells a story about how Kennedy and Polly met. It says the Henderson family grazed quite a few cattle on the open ranges of North Carolina. While one of these cattle drives near Warm Springs, Kennedy attracted to a young lady who was walking along the road. He pulled up his horse, and after some conversation, he jokingly told Polly that he believed that he would just take her home with him, which he did after a short courtship. And so they got married after, I believe they dated a month or two, and that was it, which that was common back then too. You didn't date very long. On June the 2nd of 1829, they announced the birth of their first child, which was Buford Henderson, and he actually died in the Civil War. And so I believe he died in the Battle of Chickamauga, I believe, but I can't remember that exactly. So it is believed they were actually, at the time, Kennedy and Polly and that whole family, they all left. They were actually at a church called Bull Creek Baptist Church. And like I said, Polly's dad was a pastor. And so they started a new church called River Hill Baptist Church. And so, believe it or not, Reverend Tillery, my whatever great-grandfather it is, was from Kentucky, but he had a really bad reputation for being a division-stirring pastor. Let me read what one historian actually said about Reverend Tillery. For want of a broader information and culture, questions of order and doctrine were often arising, which occasioned confusion and sometimes divisions. The first of these of which the writer has an information, arose in the River Hill Church near where the town of Marshall, North Carolina, now stands. The grounds of contention were at first a matter of a doctrinal turn. This resulted in the division of the church, which gave rise to the establishment of Walnut Creek Church, and the old church finally fell to pieces. So this disturbance and division was created and led by Isaac Tillery, who was a preacher, and at the time of the trouble was the pastor of the church. He became an antinomian and finally made shipwreck, and it went bad. And so it's very interesting to kind of read that about your family members and things of that nature. But I do think in the early churches that happened a lot. I know specifically, this is prior to the Southern Baptist Convention. It's not really around yet. The Southern Baptist Convention, South Carolina has a convention in 1824. Things were definitely, how do I say this? They were a lot different than they are now, obviously, but let me explain that a step further. So a lot of the things we deal with today, people don't, and I'm not saying it doesn't happen because sometimes it does, but for the main 90% of the things that members in our church might disagree with or get upset about are not doctrinal. They're silly, right?
Temperature.
Yeah, temperature. I was about to say that. Or you know, so-and-so,
Colors.
yeah, colors, or so-and-so didn't visit me, or music's too loud, or music's not loud enough, or, all the preference-oriented stuff. Back then, it was all doctrinal. Not all, most. Because most of your pastors were not educated. We have no record that Isaac Tillery had any formal education outside of being able to read and write. Yeah, they had a lot of doctrinal issues because, and that's another thing too, these were circuit. He preached probably twice a month, but they had business meetings every Saturday to vote so-and-so out for dancing, right? To vote so-and-so out for drunkenness or whatever.
Yeah.
Preaching was just, at that time, not really biblically based like it should have been. Part of it was not. And so you do, in the 1800s, you do see, I mean, that is one reason why there's a bad, you say all the time, the Bible Belt, by the way, Bible Belt doesn't exist anymore. But anyway, people say all the time, there's a church on every corner. Well, this time period is why, because they would get upset and take their ball and go somewhere else. And they were always usually families, family run, family led, and the preachers were usually in the families.
Right.
So that complicates things. That's one reason why I am passionate about the prophet shall be hated in his hometown. I just think you got to be really careful about that. I'm not giving a blanket, but for me personally, I wouldn't feel comfortable with pastoring where I'm from for that very reason. It can get really messy, and it did in these times. Let me give you another example of division at this time. It's very interesting that Kennedy actually moved to Lawrence, South Carolina. His dad brought them up in Lawrence, and so in November 28th of 1843 is when Kennedy actually professed Christ and was baptized. And so he joined the church in North Carolina at the time, which was Warrior Creek Baptist Church in Lawrence, which is really interesting. Is I have actually been to Warriors Creek and didn't know I was at Warriors Creek. And so Polly would not actually accept Christ until 11 years after Kennedy did. But anyway, his parents, Charles Henderson, went to Chestnut Ridge Baptist Church. And Chestnut Ridge Baptist Church is still there. Have a lot of family members buried there. That is a big church today. I think they average 600, 700 in worship. Very large church, very historical church. On May the 11th of 1844, the Chestnut Ridge Baptist Church voted to build a small building near a stream. And so the church decided, they voted on a Saturday evening that they wanted to employ some person to put bonnets over the doors and windows, and that he would have to report at the next meeting the amount of money that it would take to do that work. And then the congregation would take up that money. So Kennedy was a member at Warrior Creek, which is right near there, but his dad was a member at Chestnut Ridge. And so my grandfather, Robert, believed that it is likely that Kennedy's father had some influence because Kennedy was a carpenter. I forgot to mention that, but he is one of the few in our family that wasn't an ordained minister, but he was a carpenter, and his grandson ended up being a famous revival preacher in the hills of North Carolina. We might talk about him on another episode another day. He's quite an interesting individual. But anyway, it's believed that Kennedy's father had some influence in securing his carpenter son to perform the job. It's always tricky when you get family involved to do things you got to be careful with that. So anyway, not only was Kennedy a carpenter, he was also a blacksmith, pretty talented guy. On June the 6th of 1844, the church agreed that Kennedy could be the carpenter. They had to vote on it. So like we would have bids today and the committee handles it, like it's all out in the open, he went to another church, so that was good. But here's what's really interesting is that controversy stirred somehow. We don't know what happened, but all he was doing is putting different bonnets on this building to make it look nice. Something simple, and it says here on page 93, it is unknown what problems encountered during his carpentry work, but some controversy did develop because the church minutes state, and I quote, appointed the following brethren a committee to compromise with Kennedy Henderson, if they can, and to report back to the church at the next meeting, and it gives the names of those people. The same committee, if a compromise cannot be effected, then they must employ another man to build another house. It's interesting is that the book goes on to state that on August 10th and then again on September 7th of 1844, when all the work was completed except the plank over the windows, which is that bonnet, it wasn't until October 12th of 1844 that the church made a compromise with Kennedy on these church repairs. So there was some kind of controversy, some kind of division, and I think that's what I want you to get out of this podcast is that division can happen with anything, even something like that, something I think small.
Probably most often something small.
Yeah, that gets bigger. But what's interesting about this division, Alan, to consider historically, is that no matter what happened, it had to have created an uncomfortable situation for Kennedy. And you got to remember, his wife doesn't go to church with him. She's not saved. She's not going to be saved until 11 years after 1844. She gets saved in 1855 and spends the last 30 years of her life in a bed and then dies in 1899. And he dies in 1882. So anyway, and I mean, think about they don't know this yet, but they're getting ready to send all 4 of their sons to the Civil War to fight in the Confederacy. 2 of their sons will never come back home. That's a part of history. But anyway, it created an uncomfortable situation for him at Warrior Creek, although his father was probably in an uncomfortable situation at Chestnut Ridge. I'm sure people were talking about his son and all kind of stuff. So only 1 month after the problems were dissolved at Chestnut Ridge, on November 24th of 1844, Kennedy Henderson requested a letter of dismissal from the church at Warrior Creek. The church granted him that letter on Sunday morning, and guess what? They moved back to North Carolina. So they moved down to Lawrence. They've got 4 young children at the time, but they pack everything up. They moved to North Carolina. I think that also shows a little bit about just how much reputations and church life meant to people back then. Because if you're not getting along with people at church, you pick your stuff up and you move states. I mean, you move from South Carolina to North Carolina. Obviously, God had a plan in that because the rest, a lot of my family members would remain in the hills of North Carolina, which is a very isolated part of North Carolina. Not many churches, and so it is really cool that Kennedy's son, who survived the Civil War in a prisoner of war camp, would become a church planter of a church that is still there today, Oak Grove Baptist Church. He planted the church. He was just a deacon. He was not a preacher. But his youngest son ended up Isaac Henderson, who was named after Isaac Tillery, way down the line, became a pastor, a really great revival preacher who, at his time, I wouldn't put him at the level of Billy Graham, but I would definitely, if we could go back in a time machine to the early 1900s, if you were to say his name, anybody in North Carolina, that's Western North Carolina would have known who that was. Obviously, word had to travel by mouth. But anyway, I feel like I've rambled a little bit, Alan, but thank you for amusing me. But I really do believe that the dangers of division can happen at any time. And Kennedy, joined another church in North Carolina, and of course the rest is history, and everything went well after that. But packing up and moving because of a disagreement. What are your thoughts on that?
Over the years, I've always been a part of this church. I've been involved in personnel committees. I've been involved in buildings. I've been involved in deacons. And so I've kind of had a front row seat to some of the controversy. And it is different when now that I'm older and I've had the benefit of more years of experience in life, and you can kind of start to see things ahead of time, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
You can kind of see where something's going to become a problem.
Yeah.
And you're able to, I guess, diffuse that situation a lot easier.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of those things that I think it's very easy, and I think in this day and age where there are so many keyboard warriors that it's easy for people to stand their ground, so to speak. This is the way I believe, and you're not going to change my mind. Doesn't matter what you say, and that's all well and good, but it doesn't always have a place.
Yeah.
It may be true. It may be right. It may be ethical. It may be all of those things, but it doesn't need to be problem between believers.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
I really find it hard to believe people that have issues with other people over temperature. Yes, I don't like to sit in the sun and sweat. No, I don't like to shiver. But I'm not going to fall out with somebody if I go to their house. I mean, I'm in their house for an hour, 2 hours, maybe 3 if you're having a meal.
Yeah.
I can do anything for that.
Yeah.
Kind of almost a form of self-abasement. Mm-hmm. It's not important.
Yep.
To me. That's me personally.
No, and I agree.
I don't care what color the carpet is. Those are unimportant things.
Yep.
The important things is the Bible taught.
Mm-hmm.
Is it taught as the infallible, inerrant Word of God?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the important thing.
Yep. Yeah, we got to keep the main thing.
Yeah, whether we use the piano or whether we use the organ, those things are more things of convenience.
Yeah, and comfortability. Excuse me.
Yeah, and so that's kind of but I mean, I've always been like that about anything. Mm-hmm. If I go to a place, if I go out to eat to a restaurant, and I order my steak medium, and it comes well done, I'm going to eat it. It's not going to ruin.
Yeah.
I'm not giving those people, whether it was an accident or whether they said, oh, I know this guy, I'm going to burn his steak up.
Yeah.
I don't give them that control over me.
That's right.
And I'm kind of a laid-back guy. And sometimes folks may misinterpret that, and that's probably as much my fault as it is theirs, for not caring. It's not that I really don't care. It is that I don't care to allow things of that nature to drive me.
Exactly. Well, I've heard this before, and so I didn't come up with it. McDonald's will mess up your order hundreds of times, and you're going to go back. But one bad experience at church, you never go back. Think about it. Not just McDonald's. I mean, you can insert any
Oh,
any
yeah.
fast food there. But let me leave our listeners with this. This is a pretty cool story to not leave you on the downslope of division. Give you something to kind of ponder as you continue on your Thursday afternoon. Of course, Kennedy lived on Fishhawk Mountain, where he is buried to this day. I have been there. I have visited there. It is extremely hard to get to. It's about 15 miles of a dirt road. But once I got there, I noticed that there was a rock wall right by a spring, a natural spring, which is probably why they settled there, was because of the spring. Water was a big deal. And then, of course, I read this chapter. The old house was still standing when my grandfather went there in 1967. The house that Kennedy built in the 1860s was still there when I went. So I don't know how he did that, but that house is still there. It's a vacation home now. It's been renovated, but that whole area is like vacation-y now because it's so remote. Like, people don't really live there. And so anyway, the original logs of the home had been covered over with modern building materials, but those original logs from the 1860s are still the structure of that house, which is pretty cool. And so at the time that my grandfather went there, a relative that still lived there explained the story behind the rock wall that surrounds the spring. It was built by Kennedy and his son. They built it together. And, of course, his son's name was Isaac Tillery, who he named after his wife's father. And just before he left to fight in the Civil War, they were working on it. And he never came home from the Civil War. And so that rock wall, to this day, has not been finished. Kennedy never finished building it. So even when I went there today, it's like a random, it is a random rock wall. I think they were trying to build a house, a structure, a stone house around the spring, and it's just a rock wall because he never came home.
A spring house.
Yes, thank you, spring house. And so he never came home, and according to family tradition, never talked about it. But according to family tradition, also, the reason that they moved to Fishhawk Mountain, not just because of the church stuff, but the reason they picked that particular mountain of Macon County, North Carolina, is because he loved to hunt and fish. Family members say that Kennedy was an avid coon hunter, and one of our relatives wrote this about him. My grandfather, Kennedy Henderson, gave me a beautiful white and black spotted pup that lived to be 18 years old and made a wonderful coon dog. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and hopefully you enjoyed it. I'd love to hear more. We might do some more family history stories if we want to. You'll just have to find out. Tune in next week to see what we talk about. So I want to remind you the purpose of the podcast is share the light, speak the light, and send the light of Jesus Christ all across the airwaves of the internet. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
We'll see you next week, guys.